today, has been involved in agile software development since 1999 when he first encountered extreme programming. He was previously at ThoughtWorks for 14 years, initially as a practitioner on delivery teams and then as a principal consultant on digital and agile transformation. After ThoughtWorks, he was at Spotify for 8 years. That's why it works so well. As staff agile coach, helping the ad tech and marketing tech areas navigate hypergrowth. Currently is principal at Reinvention Cycle LLC, consulting and coaching on agile, lean, org design scale-ups, and leadership development. Let's give a big welcome to our first performer, speaker, Jason Yip. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
Jason, before I turn over the stage to you, I just have one question. As you know, CraftHub is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. We've seen extreme growth, and I don't even think we're growing as fast as the whole IT world is growing, and everything is accelerating and moving forward. One quick question for you. What would you give as advice to a young person, either a programmer or a systems engineer, starting in this field today? Thank you.
Yeah, when answering a question like that, sometimes I think I don't know if I'm confident enough to say trust what I'm saying. I could say what I would do, which is like just over the years, it's really just solve the problem in front of you. Do that. Try to stay a little bit away from some of the hype, and there's a lot of it right now, and just solve the problems in front of you. There are some fundamental things around how technology works, how people work that I don't want to say it won't change. Maybe we'll be all obeying robots later, but generally stays solid, and then trust that you'll learn what is necessary to deal with things in the future. I could be wrong, so don't blame me if you fail. Okay. Oh yeah, that's the lesson. Learn how to redirect blame to someone else. That's the skill. Okay, cool. Okay, so the talk I'm going to give is on what I call Occupy the Space, so Grassroots Guide to Engineering Product Strategy When None Exists. Here's a scenario. So tell me if you've seen this before. You're in an organization, you notice there's a low morale, so people don't seem to be very happy. And the reason why is that there's no strategy. So that's the phrase that comes up. People just say, hey, there's no strategy, so we don't know what we're doing, that sort of thing. And people complain about it. It goes up to the leaders and saying, hey, we don't have a strategy, what's going on? And then what you get in response is the leaders just keep repeating the vision. So they keep saying, hey, no, this is what we're trying to accomplish, this is what we're trying to accomplish, this is what we're trying to accomplish. But nothing really is fixed. It's still like, hey, there's no strategy. Oh, how many people have experienced this? Okay, most people, but that's why you're here. Okay, so the idea here is that when you're in this scenario, someone needs to step up. So we have a no strategy situation, leadership doesn't seem to be doing anything, what are we gonna do? We need to step up. And I'm saying that person is you. You're in this room. Unfortunately, if you don't wanna take responsibility, you can leave now. But otherwise, we're saying, hey, this is you. You're gonna be the person who steps up. So if you're going to step up, the first thing we need to understand is when we say something like no strategy, when people express that, what is exactly strategy? I'm going to rely on these two books. Have people read this before? Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, Crux, Richard Rummel. If you haven't, I would highly recommend them. You should really read Good Strategy, Bad Strategy first. The Crux is kind of hard to understand unless you read that, but I would recommend both of them. Part of this is you kind of need to know what strategy is to deal with no strategy. But I'm just giving a broad summary of it, though. Basically, Rummelt is saying strategy is problem solving for a high stakes challenge. So nothing fancier than that, but that itself is sometimes difficult. So he breaks down strategy into 3 parts. The first one is the diagnosis. So diagnosis means that we're not saying, hey, here's a problem. We're also trying to understand why is that problem happening. From that diagnosis, we'll determine a guiding policy or guiding policies. The simple way of describing that are just guiding principles for how we believe that problem can be addressed. So we say, hey, this is happening. This is generally the sort of approach we can do that will address those causes of that problem, and that's your guiding policy. And then you will take actions. So hopefully your actions are coherent with the guiding policy, which reflects your diagnosis. So it's not enough, the idea here is that it's not enough to say, hey, we can solve this problem by generally doing something. You have to actually act in ways that are consistent with those principles. And all of these 3 parts would be considered a strategy. There is feedback as well. So when in real high stakes challenge situations, your first shot at this is not going to be correct. You're going to learn from taking action where you will adjust your policy and you'll adjust your diagnosis. And this cycle, which is even more complicated than this picture, but not worth making more complicated. This is the mental model. This is sort of what we mean when we say strategy, what we should mean when we say strategy. So I'm just going to use an example here to hopefully clarify this a bit more. Actually, how many people are familiar with how ML models are trained? Kind of halfway, sort of. Okay. Basically, you will have your machine learning models. They can perform. There's a lot of dependency on the data that you're using to train them on. That's the basic idea. So this scenario here, we have machine learning models. They're not performing well because we don't have access to certain data because it's constrained or trapped within a legacy system that doesn't have a lot of access to the data, whatever, something like that. So our diagnosis is, we have a machine learning model. It's not performing well because our legacy system doesn't let us capture the data effectively. So our training isn't doing well, which means the ML model doesn't give good answers. Okay, so that's the problem. So therefore, in response, given that is our diagnosis of the situation, we go, okay, so if we're going to deal with that, we have to migrate off the legacy system. We need new services that have more accessibility to the data for training. We need to focus on migration of traffic versus migration of capability. We just need the people to use the new stuff so we get access to the data. I don't actually care about the legacy system. I just care about the people moving to the new stuff. And all new traffic should be going to the new services. Therefore, I can capture the data from that new traffic. So that's the summary of all the things that I need to do in order to address the problem. And then I have actions, like concrete actions that are coherent with that. So if I was going to do this, I would expect to have an explicit migration timeline with target outcomes. I'm not just going to say, hey, oh yeah, we should do this, and there's no plan to do it. That means you're not going to do it. And if someone was watching, you would see these teams would be building new capabilities on new services first, with maybe exceptions made to add stuff to legacy. Like that would say, okay, our actions are now coherent with the policy that we believe will solve the problem. Does that make sense? Okay, enough people shake their heads that I'm going to move on. Okay, so if that's what a strategy is. No strategy means you're missing parts of that kind of sequence. So the worst one is, I don't know if it's the worst one. It's where you're missing everything. So there's no diagnosis of the problem. There's no guiding policy. There's no coherent action. It's just a total empty blank slate. And I don't even know why you're showing up to work. You're just there. Nobody knows what they're doing. Okay? That actually probably doesn't happen as often. It depends. Actually, I should ask, like, how many people are in this situation? There's just nothing. Okay, okay. When you're shaking your hand, and we're probably saying, yeah, it's pretty much there, but there's nothing. Okay, you have also a scenario where you actually have a clear diagnosis of the problem. So we say, oh no, this is the situation we're in, this is why it's happening, but there's nothing more than that. So all we have is a description of the problem, and then we have, like if you watch what people are doing, it's incoherent either because there's no guiding policy, like we have no defined response to the problem, or we have a defined response to the problem, but none of the actual behavior is coherent or like consistent with that. So I've seen both, where sometimes you're saying, hey, we have this problem, so hey, you should fix that, and that's it. And that tends not to work. Or we say, hey, this is the problem, this is what we should be doing to solve it, and nothing is consistent with that. So it's like for show. It's like a stated strategy, but it's not the actual de facto strategy because nobody behaves in response to that. Okay, the last one is, oh, that's this one. Okay, so what's the problem with having no strategy? So any combination of that, like no diagnosis, no guiding policy, or no coherent action, confusion. So what you tend to see when there's no strategy is people will just look confused. Whether they look confused or they just act confused. So that tends to lead to lack of motivation. Most people don't like to work in an environment where they don't know what's going on or they don't understand how their actions lead to an outcome. Or you have incoherent or competing actions. So I would say anytime you see something where multiple, like two or more teams, like they are doing things that don't make sense, like they're competing against each other or they don't have any consistent result coming from their action, that you're seeing the result of a no strategy situation, whether they recognize that or not. Oh, you want to take a picture of that? Advice, that diagram won't solve your problem, but you know. That's not a strategy. Okay, so countermeasures. So, okay, now we'll talk about, hey, what do you do if you're in this situation? Again, I'm talking about this as if you have to be the person to step up, right? So I'm assuming if you have power and authority to fix it, just fix it. Why are you here? Just fix the problem. But here is when you're seeing this and your leadership team, your leadership organization isn't filling it in, and you're stepping in to try to address it. There is some similarity to what an actual leader would do, but the idea here is you're filling the space because it's empty. Okay, the overall concept of this talk is what I'm calling occupy the space. I will then talk about how you occupy that space with like three other patterns, let's call it. And then there's a final thing, which I'm going to call it's like an inner challenge type problem. I will have a picture of this at the end, so you can take a picture of it again as well. But let's talk about this first idea of occupying this space. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to check here, because I never know. Do people know what South Park is? Have you watched like early, like first season South Park? First season South Park? No, I got some shaking heads. Okay, so in the first season of South Park, they had an episode about the underpants gnomes. Do people know the underpants gnomes? Okay, about half. Okay, it doesn't make any sense, but that's the point. So they have these gnomes that they had a business strategy. Their business strategy started with stealing underpants. And then at the end of their strategy, the idea of the strategy, they steal underpants and they would have profit. But in the middle, there was just this empty space. They had this question mark. Okay, so this idea of this question mark, this empty space, that means they have no strategy. So hey, we have action, stealing underpants, we have a goal, which is profit, but we have no way to get there, so it's an empty space. So the idea, the metaphor I'm using here of occupying the space is, hey, when you have this empty space where there should be strategy, you want to fill that space. So you move yourself in there, and then that's occupying the space. So that's the idea. This helps me remember it, so hopefully it helps you. If you don't like South Park, you can come with a different metaphor, but that's the idea. Okay, so when there is an empty space where there should be a strategy, you don't, like there's a few different responses. I could complain that someone should fill that space. Hey, why isn't anyone filling this space? It's an empty space, there's a strategy. Why aren't the leaders stepping up? I can do that. I could wait for someone else, so not another leader, but maybe someone else comes in and they fill the space. Maybe they fill that space with something that is not any good. So they fill the space with a bad strategy, so that's not necessarily that great either. Or I say, hey, I'm capable, right? I was capable of seeing the problem. Am I not capable of stepping up and helping solve it? So I would say those first two choices are not useful, right? Complaining that other people aren't stepping up is not that useful. because if the complaining worked, we wouldn't keep complaining. Problem would be solved. Sometimes maybe you have other people who do fill and they're good at it. That's fine. But part of the context here is sometimes people fill it and they're not any good either, so you get a bad strategy. The idea is that, okay, it would be useful if we can fill it ourselves, and hopefully we are capable. If you're not capable, then yes, don't fill the strategy, fill the space, because you're going to make it worse. But this comes down to two outcomes that can happen. If you step in and fill the space, you could have it. Your strategy is accepted because it's competent and you have buy-in, and it's all great. No more empty space, there's a strategy, it's all good. Or two, your strategy is not accepted, but because you attempted to fill it, it kind of forces other people to correct the strategy, right? Because you just filled that empty space, there's no longer something there, but you're saying it's no good, and then other leaders will tend to say, hey, what are you doing? That's not correct, it should be this instead. Either way, that's acceptable, right? I no longer have an empty space because I forced someone else to correct the thing that I put in there, okay? The first one's better though. I'm just thinking about your career growth here. You don't always want to have the thing, hey, every time you try to fill an empty space, it's bad and we have to fix it. It's better if you fill the space and it's good, so let's talk about how to do that. And if we want to talk about having a good strategy, we're back to the three parts, right? So if I'm going to fill the empty space, I'm going to have a good diagnosis, I'm going to have good guiding policy, I'm going to have coherent action. Okay, now here's a warning though. Even though I have yet to see this as a problem. So every time I've done stuff like this, I've been kind of back in my mind, I've been worried about this, but I've never seen it happen. So there's a dynamic that occurs generally when you solve a problem for someone, you get a kind of a +1. So let's say, hey, there's no strategy. I helped fill that gap. I get a +1 in the eyes of the people around me. Oh, wow, you helped solve a problem. I'm going to give you a +1. Now, you have to be aware, there was someone else who was supposed to fill that space who didn't, and you just gave them a -1. Now it's kind of like, hey, if you were competent, why was there an empty space? Why did Jason have to come in and fill it for you? You can have this dynamic. I have never actually seen this. Most of the time, it's like that person's just too busy, so they go, oh, wow, great, thanks, like I didn't have time. You get that kind of thing, but I'm always wary that this could occur. So it's something you want to pay attention to. I was just talking to someone here about, like, there are politics involved when you're dealing with these sort of things, and you just need to be aware of them. Even though, again, I've never actually seen this happen. Maybe because I'm always like watching for it, but yeah, never seen it happen. Okay, so summary of this idea of occupy the space, which is the overarching concept. When there is a strategy gap, you fill it yourself. It either leads to acceptance of your strategy or it forces leaders to correct it. Either way, you no longer have a gap. Right? Now solves the problem. We no longer have no strategy. Great. Okay, now we talked about your strategy, like the better option here is your strategy is accepted because it's competent and has buy-in. And now we're going to talk about how to increase the likelihood that you have the better scenario. So how do I ensure, how do I increase the probability that the strategy is competent and has buy-in? And then we have three tools or tactics to do that. The first one is what I call draft, share, decide. A phenomenon I've observed, when you try to do something and you get a lot of people involved, it's very difficult to get to depth. So if you can imagine, let's imagine we were all in a meeting and we start the meeting, and of course we're going to start the meeting and we're going to introduce ourselves. So we'll go around and we'll introduce ourselves, and by the time we finish introducing ourselves, the meeting's over. So that's okay if the topic of the meeting is shallow, but if you actually have to get to depth, I can't do it. Right? I need less people because I can't waste time just doing introductions. We kind of have to go, okay, we're going, and we spend the time to get to depth. And when we are doing strategy topics, you have to get to depth. So I can't do it if I have a lot of people. Because you can't get to depth with a lot of people, if you have a strategy that's created by a committee, it'll tend to be shallow, which means it tends not to be good. Okay, does that make sense? I don't know, like, if people seen this before where you go, hey, here's our strategy group, and there's like 100 people in it, and everything they come up with is really bad. Okay? Now, there's that concept, but there's another thing that happens, and I borrowed this from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This idea that if you don't involve people in something, they won't commit to it. So, and this is kind of a counterforce, right? I've just said, hey, I can't have too many people involved because if I do, I can't get the depth and the thing will be shallow. But if I don't get them involved, I can't get them to commit. So how do I deal with these competing forces? And this is the thing I came up with. So start small. So this is the draft. Usually I have like 3 to 5 people to discuss it. Usually 1 to 2 people will actually write it up, but you're just a small group. This group is intended to be the group that gets to depth. So they're going to draft something that gets to depth. Then they're going to share it with a broader group. So this can be staged, but roughly I've done things where, again, this is still not the buy-in. There's some buy-in here, but it's more with the smallest group, I don't necessarily have the full perspective. So I'm going to have a slightly larger, typically call this like a North Star group, whatever you want to call it, that they flesh out that initial strategy, and then they'll give feedback there. And then you stage to a even broader sharing, which is like, hey, this is everyone. And that final group is more buy-in than getting feedback. So small group to start to draft something, initial larger group to share and get some feedback to clean up the strategy, and then an even larger group to share, which then deals with involvement, buy-in type dynamics. What I've found, if you've done this well, if you've selected the groups correctly, by the time you get to sharing with everyone, there's usually not that much feedback you get that is actually significant. It's more buy-in that you get at the end. Like maybe you rename some stuff or whatever, but for the most part, if you pick the right groups, most of the stuff are done. There's this kind of dynamic you'll see as well. When you ask for feedback about something like a strategy, some people will go to someone else to say, hey, what do you think about this? So if you have the person that people tend to go to ask, what do you think about this? And you get them in the initial group, it's done, right? Like they go, oh, you've already involved them, so I'm good, right? Because I didn't really have a strong opinion, okay? Okay, and then when you've done this, then you make the decision, you can finalize and have like formalize, hey, this is our strategy, everyone's bought in, we're pretty sure it's good, and we're cool. Okay, so that's draft, share, decide. Again, I mentioned this before, the sharing part is really more about buy-in than it is getting additional insight. So you don't really have to set it up as if, oh, it has to be super complicated because we're gonna get all this different feedback that's gonna come from the broader group. Practically, that doesn't actually happen. It's kind of a weird thing. It's like, even in a democracy, there's only a small subset of people that are actually contributing anything. But that happens. Oh, can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so draft, share, decide, draft the strategy with a small group, share with a broader group for feedback, and then you decide on the final version. I put final in quotes because strategy evolves with contact with reality, which is why you have that feedback loop. When you take action, things get adjusted, but that's the one you go with. Okay. I should actually check. Do people know what I mean when I say staff plus engineer? Because I don't know what the promotion. Okay, so I have my stereotypical old guy with a white beard programmer, which not actually common. Like it's not always typical these days. But the general characteristics. So the staff plus engineer is referring to a very senior, experienced individual contributor within your organization. That either they've been around for a while, they know a lot about how the systems work, and therefore they have a lot of implicit respect and authority independent of reporting lines. So like there's no statement here, because they could look like anybody, like it could be any kind of background. It's more that they have these characteristics. They have implicit authority, independent reporting line due to their experience and their knowledge within the organization, okay? I put this as staff plus engineers because there's a tendency for that type of role to have these characteristics, but it's not really the title, it's more the properties that you're looking for. Okay, ideally, this is you. So if it's you, then it's good. You have been around for a while. You know a lot about how the systems work. People respect and have your authority independent of your position in the company. And that would be great. If you can do that, then hey, you're already like one up. If not, then you want to work out who those people are and you get them involved in your effort. Why? 2 reasons. One, because of their knowledge, of their experience, they probably have a perspective that is useful to incorporate into your strategy. So this is part of the competence of the strategy. You want their perspective because they know a lot about the things. They can point out things that you didn't anticipate. And 2, their involvement can sometimes automatically create buy-in. So it's what I mentioned before. Hey, what does so-and-so think about this? These people are those so-and-so people. Like they go, oh, they've been around for a while. They know a lot of stuff. I should see what they think about this. Oh, wait a minute. They were involved in creating this. I don't even have to ask that question anymore. I'm already kind of automatically bought in. Okay? So the idea with getting staff plus engineers involved is the idea that the most senior technical ICs, individual contributors, tend to have influence. You want to exploit this and get them involved. Okay, this next one is this idea of recruiting the dedicated liaisons. So let's say here's option 1. I'm going to say, hey, this is my proposed strategy. And option 2 is, this is my proposed strategy, and all the dependent groups for the strategy, they've already bought in. The second one is obviously stronger, right? One of the things that does happen when you introduce or propose a strategy, or people will say, hey, what does security think about it? What does legal think about it? What does infrastructure think about it? Because people know that, oh, wait a minute, we can't really do this unless all these dependent groups are also involved and say they're okay. If you say, hey, we propose this, and I've already checked with everybody, they're all on board, people go, oh, great, like saves me time, we're all good, I don't have any questions anymore, we're ready moving forward. Okay, so getting that buy-in makes your strategy stronger. And if you want to get dependent groups bought in, let's say you do. You need good relationships with those dependent groups. I don't think I've ever seen this work where they hate you and then you can get their buy-in easily. That doesn't normally happen. So if they you have a good relationship with these dependent groups, when you propose something, it's much easier to get them bought in. And a very useful technique to establish those group relationships is using dedicated liaisons. This idea I actually got from this book, One Mission. How many people have read Team of Teams? Generally, oh, wow, okay, interesting. That's worth reading. I actually think this is a better book, though. So this is almost like a sequel to Team of Teams. Team of Teams is talking about, it was kind of the US Special Operations Command and how they restructured to deal with Al-Qaeda, because they were kind of, everyone was like, just my team's the best, and they didn't really work well together. So they have a structure here to try to help the teams coordinate and collaborate more effectively. One Mission is almost like it's the detailed version of Team of Teams. It's more from the perspective of, okay, what if you actually had to do it in more details? So one of the concepts they talk about is how you get actual cooperation. So it's not enough to have bureaucracy to encourage cooperation. So if I just said, oh, our shared manager told us that we should work together, that doesn't work at scale. Just because they say, hey, we're one team, doesn't make us one team. Like I go, hey, yeah, sure, we're one team and I hate you, so we're not, every time you ask for something, I'm gonna pretend I didn't hear it, right? That's what actually happens at scale. So instead, we rely on liaisons. So you develop actual human, you use humans to connect. You kind of send these people over to create your human-to-human network. Oops, whoa. I just went really fast for some reason. Okay, so kind of a neat trick here is when you have a liaison, so you're sending a person to represent your team, you make sure you pick the most well-mannered, intelligent person that you can find. Because there's a funny dynamic that occurs. When people don't know your team, the person you send as a representative all they can do is assume that you're just like that representative. So if you send your friendliest, like most charming, charismatic person to be your representative, they assume everyone on your team is also charming and charismatic, even if you're all a bunch of knuckleheads, right? Because they've never met you. They don't know. All they can tell is the person you send. So one of the tactics they did, like they talked about in one mission, was they find like the person they send is not the low-ranking person. They send the best person over. And then all of a sudden the relationship gets really strong. Every time they interacted with the team, they kind of came in with this inbuilt respect because they were saying, oh, wow, you must be just like our liaison. So they were like very respectful and all this kind of stuff. And they're going, oh, wow. Little do they know that we're all horrible people. But it works. And then over time, you kind of assume you get better, so they don't realize they've been tricked. Okay, so a strategy with buy-in from other groups is stronger if you use these dedicated liaisons. A strategy with buy-in from other groups is stronger. If you want to get that buy-in from other groups, it's useful to have a dedicated person to build relationships. Okay, so those were tactics around how to increase the likelihood that your strategy that you used to fill the space was both competent and got buy-in. And this final concept is really about a kind of an inner game type thing. So it's more of you being the person that's going to try to do this. You're going to try to occupy this space, and what do you need to account for? So here's a scenario which I have seen happen before. You fill the space, and you've addressed that strategy gap. The area that you helped is now under control and doing well. So we no longer have a strategy gap. People aren't confused anymore. Everything's lined up. The area is now operating very effectively. You've solved the problem. It's all great, right? But what you've just done is you've made that area attractive for someone to take over and steal credit, right? When it was a mess, nobody wants to be involved with it. When it's effective, you attract empire builders. So do people have empire builders in their organization? Is it just me? No, everyone else is perfect. We're all like, hey, everyone's very, everyone's a team member. Power doesn't exist in organizations. Politics is not a real thing. But yeah, this happens, right? So you have to make a choice here. So choice number one, you say, hey, I'm not going to do this because all the credit's going to be stolen. These empire builders are going to take over. So what you've chosen, if you say, hey, I'm not going to deal with this, and I'm not going to help here, is that you end up with the de facto scenario, which is you continue with no strategy, you have the associated confusion, you have the associated lack of motivation, incoherent action, etc. So that's like you say, hey, I'm not going to do something because someone's going to steal credit, and then you just end up where you were before, no strategy. Or you help out, you establish a clear strategy, and then someone steals credit for it. And I would argue the one on the right is less bad. This is a very kind of harsh thing to accept. I'm not saying this always happens. It's more like you have to, are you willing to accept that this is a possibility and do it anyway? Right? And that's a kind of a choice that you have to make for yourself. You say, hey, I can't take this. Forget about those people. I'm just going to accept the no strategy. Maybe I'll fill up my resume and go somewhere else. But this is something I think you do need to be clear in your head about what you think about this before you get into this, because this can happen. Okay. So don't sweat ownership is when you come up with a good strategy, it's possible someone else with more power will show up and take credit. And I would argue this is still better than having a strategy gap, but this is really a personal choice. Like who do you want to be? What's acceptable to you? And yeah, it's okay. It's okay if you say, because it can be okay for you to say, hey, no, I'm not willing to do it. Call you have to make. So to summarize, if you have low morale, and the reason is that there's no strategy, and your leader response is just to repeat the vision, which means they're not filling the gap effectively, my argument is you occupy the space. Occupying the space being this overall concept. You also have tactics for how you do that effectively, draft, share, decide, getting staff plus engineers involved, which means getting influential individual contributors involved, recruiting dedicated liaisons to help with establishing relationships with dependent groups, and dealing with this inner challenge of not caring that much about ownership if you're successful. I would say, like, in the long run, if the overall organization is always stealing your work, maybe find another one. But, you know, it will happen, and you just kind of have to accept it. Okay, that's it. Questions?
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. My takeaway from it, being a non-IT person, is this works across any industry, I believe, not just IT. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, this is for pretty much any organization, I would say.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, you've put your questions up. I'll be reading them. Jason will be answering them. How can I know I'm capable of occupying the space?
You just try it. So it's kind of why I had that diagram before of worst case, if you're not capable and you try it, someone will fix it. They'll just go, okay, you're not ready for this, and they fix it. You still solve the problem. And then you've learned. You've learned to go, oh, wait a minute, I didn't really understand what was going on. I couldn't diagnose effectively. Everything I came up with was off. But then you kind of learn from that experience. There is hopefully, I can't guarantee that's always the case, hopefully a recognition that, hey, at least a person attempted it. And then they can get coaching or whatever to start to clean it up. So, and no matter what, hey, you still forced a reaction which causes the space to be filled, so it's still good. There's really no way of, I think, getting good at strategy except trying it. So, you know, it doesn't really matter whether you're capable or not.
Okay. How do you deal with a situation when there is a bad strategy, you propose a good one, backed by tons of data, and that means too many minus ones, so they dismiss it?
Okay, I didn't talk about this one mainly because I never really encountered this really, but the things I was prepared to do. So if you start saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm getting a bad reaction from someone, there's something, it's almost like that last thing I mentioned of shift credit. So you try to make it seem like that person who was taking the -1 came up with it and you were just representing them or something, so that you shift the +1 to that person. Like that's like almost an immediate thing. You kind of shift ownership because the blowback is too dangerous. So you're trying to say, hey, I'm trying to make that person look good, so therefore I'm not their enemy. There are also some things where you could say, okay, I'm going to try to work indirectly through someone who's already influential for the kind of the power players there. So anyone who's taking a -1, I'm not going to do it myself. I'm going to work through someone they already trust rather than do it directly. So there's these kind of like a roundabout type things. I didn't talk too much about this here because really I've never actually had to deal with that, even though I was prepared to deal with that because I was watching for it. I just never had to do it. Hopefully that answers the question. Like this game is, if you actually get that blowback, it's a lot more dangerous game, which is yet another, that's an even bigger challenge because you're saying, are you willing to risk that to attempt to do this? That's a little harder decision to make.
Okay, great. How could we get around that sometimes no strategy viewed as autonomy? So when we are suggesting a strategy, we threaten autonomy. And a personal note, somebody loves your shirt.
Oh, okay, cool. Does people know this reference? Calvin and Hobbes and Clerks? Okay, yes, that's interesting. I actually have encountered this before. Like, this is almost like a different topic. Like sometimes I think people interpret autonomy as I get to do whatever I feel like, which I go, that's not the point. The idea is that we have this broader concept like, hey, here's the problem we're all dealing with, and you are free to act within kind of a defined context in order to try to contribute to solving this overall problem. Now, in order for you to be effective at being an effective autonomous team, you do need clarity of that overall strategy. Otherwise, you don't know what you're doing, right? Because you go, hey, we're acting independently, but what problem are we solving? Like, that the shared problem, what kind of guiding principles are we using to make our local decisions? That doesn't exist. So there's this thing, when you're dealing with, sometimes there is a clarification of what we mean by autonomy, and sometimes I have to deal with this where very clearly we're going, no, we are not saying autonomy means you get to do what you feel like. It's more being free to act within, like using all your abilities, being free to act given this context which we are going to clearly define, right? Most people will respond to that. Some people don't, and you just have to deal with that.
Okay, great. I've seen this work at tech companies with bottoms-up culture, not in legacy industries. Have you seen examples of this in industries like insurance or healthcare? This was my thought exactly.
I think potentially in the legacy industry, you are going to see those power dynamic things that I said I've never seen before happen. So where you go, oh, if I do this, I'm going to make them look bad, and they will go like come after you just because you made them look bad. I would suspect that. I might be too cynical though, right? Like even in legacy places, it doesn't mean like, just because it's legacy doesn't mean people are bad people. It just means that that's just what the system is. So you kind of have to play by ear. Like I almost say, I would not expect the approach you take is not defined by, are you a big tech company or a legacy company? It's more the specific people that are involved. So like if I say, hey, you're in it, and I don't know your specific scenario, I'd go look at the specific people, look at how they relate to each other, like look at their past behavior, and then make a judgment off of that. Don't just say, oh, they are legacy insurance, so therefore all legacy insurance people are going to behave a particular way. That's probably more dangerous. You want to get as much intel as you can about what your context is before you decide how to approach this, is my general advice.
Okay, one can never get all the information or assess all the risks in advance. How do you know that the strategy is good enough to start acting?
There's no answer to this. You're going to have, usually in most contexts, you only have so much time to work with, so it's as good as you can get. There's another part of this where it's almost like you get the generic answer of, oh, you just have to do this a lot, then you'll know how much you need to move forward. And I don't really know how to universalize that. Like I don't know how to say, if you don't know how to do it, I don't know how to tell you how to make that judgment call. It's almost like you've done this enough, you know where that, like this is good enough or it's not. Partly, this is why it's useful to get those, if you think about buy-in and getting senior ICs involved, getting dependent groups involved, they'll give you some insight about where that point is, because they'll say, oh, this is not enough, right? And they've been around, so they kind of know. Or the dependent group says, this is not enough, so you go, oh, okay, right? It's unlikely you'll get buy-in for a strategy unless it's enough. So, and I'd be more inclined to say start earlier and then get them to get the feedback earlier. Say, hey, it's not quite enough, and then, okay, you're doing this. This is partly why I have the draft share decide idea, right? The draft version is never enough. That's the point. It's not enough, and then as I get more input, it becomes enough. But could you collectively go too far or go too little? Yes, but to some extent, it doesn't matter if you got everyone involved. If everyone bought in and it wasn't enough or it was too much, it doesn't matter. We were all in it together, so it's fine.
Okay, there's two left. I'll let you choose. We only have time for one more.
Complaining, superficial strategy started by management. How can you never get all? Okay, do I necessarily need to connect my diagnosis to leadership vision for this to? Let's say, do I necessarily? This one got a vote. So after complaining, a superficial strategy has been established by management. How do I deal with this case? You still have no strategy, right? They had some shallow, useless strategy that they said, hey, now this is our new strategy. I've actually dealt with this before, where they say, hey, no, okay, we're going to deal with strategy, and they just put this thing in and saying, that's not a strategy. There's like nothing here. You can't use it. You still do what I just said. You might frame it differently, saying, oh, I just tried to flesh out the strategy, and then you add an actual depth to it, and then that's all you do. But it's still the same tactics, right? A superficial strategy is not a strategy. It's missing stuff. So you step in anyway because it's not enough. Okay, but there's no difference at that point.
Okay. Okay, Jason, thank you very much. for a wonderful